The crimson sunset over Arizona's Gila Valley painted the desert sky like spilled blood across ancient canvas, casting long shadows over the small homestead where Elizabeth Beth Harrison stood beside the stone well that had sustained her family for 15 years. The 43-year-old widow watched with growing alarm as the water level dropped lower each day, not from drought or natural causes, but from the systematic theft being orchestrated by men who believed they could steal liquid life itself from those too weak to defend it. Beth's weathered hands gripped the well's stone rim as she studied the dust clouds rising from the eastern mesa, where the machinery of the Consolidated Water Company carved new channels that diverted mountain streams away from homesteads and toward the mining operations that promised greater profits than the survival of farming families. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver from grief and hardship, was pulled back beneath a practical bonnet that couldn't hide the intelligence burning in her gray eyes, eyes that had seen too much corruption and learned too many dangerous secrets to ever be fooled by corporate promises of progress and prosperity. The homestead around her bore the marks of 3 years of struggle since her husband Daniel's death in what authorities had ruled an accidental fall from his horse, though Beth knew better. Daniel Harrison had been a territorial water commissioner whose investigation into fraudulent water rights had made him dangerous to powerful men who measured human worth in terms of quarterly profits. His death had been as carefully planned as the water diversions that were now slowly strangling every honest farmer in the valley. "Mama Beth," came a voice from the porch, soft with worry and the Mexican accent of the Morales family who had worked the Harrison ranch since before Beth's marriage. Rosa Morales emerged from the modest ranch house carrying a ceramic jug and the concerned expression of someone who understood that water was life in the desert, and life was becoming increasingly precarious for all of them. "The spring behind the house is running slower today," Rosa reported, setting down the jug with movements that reflected 15 years of friendship and shared hardship. "Miguel says the water table is dropping faster than it should, even in dry season. Someone is taking more than their share upstream." Beth nodded grimly, her mind working through calculations that would have impressed the engineering surveyors who had drawn the original water rights maps for Gila Valley. Daniel had taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed how water moved through the desert landscape, knowledge that had made their ranch one of the most successful in the territory, before corporate interests decided that small farmers were obstacles to larger profits. "Rosa, how much water do we have in reserve?" Beth asked, though she already knew the answer would not provide comfort. "Perhaps 2 weeks if we're very careful," Rosa replied, her dark eyes reflecting the fear of someone who had lived through droughts and understood the desperation that came when the wells ran dry. "But Beth, it's not just us. The Martinez family, the O'Connors, even the Apaches who have treaty rights to the spring water, everyone is facing the same problem." The systematic nature of the crisis was what convinced Beth that this was not natural drought, but deliberate economic warfare. The Consolidated Water Company had arrived in Gila Valley 6 months earlier with territorial permits that allegedly gave them rights to excess water for mining operations. But their definition of excess seemed to include every drop that didn't flow directly through their corporate channels. As if summoned by their conversation about water theft, riders appeared on the horizon, moving toward the Harrison homestead with the purposeful confidence of men who believed themselves unopposed. Beth counted 6 horsemen, their dust trail suggesting they had ridden hard from the direction of the water company's operations center in the territorial capital. "Rosa," Beth said quietly, Take the children inside and keep them away from the windows. I think we're about to receive visitors who haven't come here to discuss reasonable solutions to water distribution problems." As the riders drew closer, Beth could see that these were not the territorial officials or mining company supervisors she had been expecting. Instead, they appeared to be professional gunmen whose expensive weapons and coordinated movements marked them as mercenaries hired to solve problems that legal proceedings had failed to address. Their leader was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of pale complexion that spoke of a life spent in saloons and gambling halls rather than under honest desert sun. "Mrs. Harrison," the leader called out as they reined in their horses near the well. "My name is Captain Marcus Stone, representing the interests of the Consolidated Water Company. I understand you've been experiencing some difficulties with your water supply." Beth remained beside the well, her hand resting casually on the stone rim in a position that concealed her proximity to the Winchester rifle she had placed there before the riders arrived. Daniel had taught her to shoot during their early years of marriage, but more importantly, he had taught her to think tactically when facing opponents who relied on intimidation rather than law. "Captain Stone," she replied with careful neutrality. "If you're here about water rights, I'm afraid you'll need to speak with territorial authorities. My late husband's permits are all in order, and I have legal documentation for every drop of water that flows through this property." Stone's smile was cold as winter wind across the Sonoran desert. "Mrs. Harrison, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of our visit. The territorial government has authorized the Consolidated Water Company to redirect water resources for the greater good of territorial development. Your domestic needs are no longer a priority concern." The euphemism was crude, but clear. Stone and his mercenaries intended to complete the theft of her water rights through intimidation and violence if necessary. Beth had heard similar reports from other homesteads throughout the valley. Families driven from their land not by drought or economic hardship, but by corporate manipulation backed by hired guns. "Captain Stone," Beth said with dangerous quiet, "I think you should know that my late husband was territorial water commissioner for this district. I'm familiar with water law, territorial authority, and the difference between legitimate government action and corporate theft disguised as legal procedure." Stone's expression shifted slightly as he absorbed the implications of what she had revealed. A territorial water commissioner's widow would have access to documentation and legal knowledge that most homestead families lacked, making her a more dangerous opponent than the simple farmer's wife he had expected to intimidate into submission. "Mrs. Harrison," Stone said with forced politeness, "perhaps you'd be willing to show me these documents you mentioned. The water company wants to ensure that all legal requirements are properly satisfied before any adjustments to water distribution take place." Beth's mind raced through the tactical implications of Stone's request. If she revealed the location of Daniel's files, the mercenaries would almost certainly destroy evidence that could expose the corruption behind the water company's operations. But if she refused, they would probably search the property anyway, and might discover secrets that were far more dangerous than simple water rights documentation. "Captain Stone," she said finally, "the documents are stored in the territorial capital under federal protection, but I'd be happy to accompany you there to review them with proper legal counsel present." Stone's laugh was like the sound of gravel in a tin cup. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm afraid that won't be necessary. The Consolidated Water Company has been authorized to resolve water distribution issues through direct action when legal procedures prove insufficient." As Stone spoke, his men began dismounting and spreading out to surround the well area, their movements coordinated with the efficiency of professionals who had done this kind of work many times before. Beth recognized the tactical positioning from Daniel's descriptions of military operations during his service in the territorial militia, and she understood that peaceful resolution was no longer possible. "Rosa," she called toward the house without taking her eyes off the mercenaries. "Please bring Captain Stone and his men some water from our emergency supply. It's only Christian hospitality to offer refreshment to travelers, regardless of their intentions." The request seemed innocent enough, but Rosa Morales had known Beth Harrison for 15 years and understood that her friend never made casual conversation during moments of crisis. The mention of emergency supply was a coded reference to preparations that Beth and Daniel had made for exactly this type of confrontation. "Of course." "Beth," Rosa replied from the safety of the porch. "I'll bring water for everyone." As Rosa disappeared into the house, Beth noticed one of Stone's men examining the well mechanism with professional interest. The mercenary was younger than his companions, with the kind of technical knowledge that suggested experience with engineering or mining operations. "Interesting construction," the young mercenary observed, studying the stonework and wooden beam system that Daniel had installed to maximize water extraction efficiency. "This well is drawing from an underground stream that probably connects to the main aquifer system. If someone wanted to redirect the flow, they'd just need to dig a new channel about 200 yards upstream." Stone's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had just received valuable intelligence. "Very interesting indeed. It sounds like Mrs. Harrison's water problems could be solved quite easily with proper engineering consultation." The threat was clear enough. Stone intended to not just steal her water, but to make the theft permanent by rerouting the underground stream that fed her well. Without legal recourse or community support, Beth would be forced to abandon the homestead that had been her family's life for 15 years. But what Stone didn't know was that Elizabeth Harrison was not just any territorial water commissioner's widow. She was the keeper of records that documented 15 years of systematic corruption in water rights allocation, mining permits, and territorial land grants. Hidden in the ranch house were documents that could destroy not just the Consolidated Water Company, but the entire network of political and business interests that profited from the exploitation of honest families throughout Arizona territory. "Captain Stone," Beth said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I think you should know that threatening a territorial official's widow is generally considered poor judgment in these parts. My late husband had many friends who take a dim view of corporate intimidation tactics." Stone's confidence faltered slightly as he considered the possibility that Beth Harrison might have more resources and connections than he had initially assumed. But greed and professional pride quickly overcame caution, and he gestured for his men to continue their examination of the well and surrounding property. "Mrs. Harrison," Stone said with finality, "the Consolidated Water Company will be redirecting this water source within the week. You have 3 days to make arrangements for alternative supply or relocation. This conversation is over." As the mercenaries prepared to leave, having completed their reconnaissance and delivered their ultimatum, Beth felt the familiar mixture of rage and determination that had sustained her through 3 years of widowhood and corporate persecution. But this time, she also felt something else, a cold anticipation that came from finally having an opportunity to use weapons that Daniel had insisted should remain hidden until the moment when hiding was no longer possible. Stone and his men rode away as confidently as they had arrived, certain that they had just solved another property acquisition problem through superior force and legal intimidation. What they didn't realize was that they had just declared war on someone who possessed the knowledge and documentation to destroy their entire operation and everyone who had profited from it. As the dust settled and Rosa emerged from the house carrying an actual jug of water, Beth walked to the ranch house with the measured steps of someone who had finally accepted the burden that Daniel's death had placed upon her shoulders. The time for hiding was over, and the time for justice was about to begin. Hidden in the ranch house were records that would shake Arizona territory to its foundations and expose corruption that reached from local water companies to territorial governors. But first, Beth Harrison had to survive long enough to get those records to people who could use them to restore law and order to a region that had been abandoned to corporate greed and hired violence. The widow who had seemed like such an easy target was about to demonstrate that some secrets were more dangerous than any gun, and some widows carried weapons that no amount of money or mercenary skill could defeat. Hey everyone, the tension is already building here in the Gila Valley. Captain Stone and his mercenaries think they're dealing with a helpless widow. But something tells me Beth Harrison has a few surprises up her sleeve. That mention of her husband being a territorial water commissioner has me very intrigued. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think Beth is hiding. And if you're already hooked on this tale of water wars and hidden corruption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The pale light of dawn crept across the Gila Valley, like hope struggling against despair, illuminating the Harrison homestead, where Beth stood in her late husband's study, surrounded by the careful records that had defined Daniel Harrison's career as territorial water commissioner. The room remained exactly as he had left it 3 years ago, maps covering every wall, filing cabinets filled with detailed surveys, and a massive oak desk where he had spent countless evenings documenting the systematic corruption that was slowly strangling honest settlement throughout Arizona territory. Beth's fingers traced the leather binding of Daniel's personal journal, a book she had been afraid to read until Stone's ultimatum forced her to confront the full scope of what her husband had discovered. The journal contained more than just official water distribution records. It held the detailed documentation of bribes, fraudulent permits, and illegal diversions that had transformed water rights from a tool of territorial development into a weapon of corporate conquest. Beth, Rosa's voice called softly from the doorway. Miguel has finished checking the property boundaries. He says there are fresh survey stakes along the creek that weren't there yesterday. Someone has been marking new channel routes while we slept. The confirmation of Stone's intentions sent a chill through Beth's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve to use the weapons Daniel had left in her care. Rosa, I need to show you something that will help you understand why Captain Stone is so confident about stealing our water, and why stopping him is more important than just saving our ranch. Beth opened Daniel's journal to a page marked with a pressed wildflower their wedding anniversary, when he had finally revealed the true scope of what he had discovered during his years as water commissioner. The entry was written in his careful hand, but the words carried the urgency of someone who understood that powerful men were planning his death. Elizabeth, my beloved, Beth read aloud. If you are reading this journal, then my investigation into territorial water corruption has probably cost me my life. What I have discovered is larger and more dangerous than simple graft or political favoritism. There is a conspiracy that reaches from local water companies to Washington Depot Manalbai. designed to transfer control of Western water resources from territorial governments to Eastern corporate interests. Rosa crossed herself as the implications of Daniel's words became clear. Dios mío. Beth, your husband was killed because he discovered this conspiracy. Beth nodded, turning to pages that contained detailed maps showing how water rights throughout Arizona territory had been systematically reassigned through forged documents, bribed officials, and legal technicalities that no honest territorial government would have authorized. Daniel spent 5 years tracing the connections between water companies, mining corporations, railroad interests, and territorial politicians. What he found was a network of corruption that could control the entire future of the American Southwest. The maps revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Daniel had uncovered. Water rights that had been granted to homestead families were being transferred to corporate entities through legal manipulations that appeared legitimate on the surface, but violated every principle of territorial water law. Mining companies that should have been required to provide their own water sources were being given access to agricultural supplies that had sustained farming communities for decades. But Beth, Rosa said as she studied the overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud, if Daniel had all this proof, why didn't he expose the conspiracy while he was still alive? Beth's expression grew somber as she turned to the final entries in her husband's journal, where his handwriting became increasingly urgent, and the margins were filled with observations about being followed, threatened, and warned by territorial officials to abandon his investigation. The corruption reaches too high for territorial authorities to address. Beth read from Daniel's final entry. Governor Williams is taking bribes. Federal Judge Morrison is compromised. Even the Territorial Marshal's office has been infiltrated by corporate interests. The only way to expose this conspiracy is through federal intervention, but that will require evidence so comprehensive and irrefutable that Washington cannot ignore it. Rosa's eyes widened as she grasped the implications of what Beth was revealing. Your husband was preparing to take this evidence to Washington when he was killed. Exactly, Beth confirmed, moving to a hidden panel in the study wall that revealed a concealed safe containing documents that Daniel had considered too dangerous to store in official files. But Daniel was also a practical man who understood that powerful enemies don't give up just because one investigator dies. He prepared contingency plans that would allow his work to continue, even if he couldn't complete it himself. The safe contained materials that would have staggered federal investigators if they had understood their significance. Original territorial water rights documents showing how corporate claims were fraudulent. Financial records proving that territorial officials had taken bribes to approve illegal water diversions. Most damaging of all, correspondence between Eastern corporate executives discussing their plans to control Western water resources regardless of territorial law or federal oversight. Sweet Mother of God, Rosa whispered, as she examined documents that could destroy political careers and reshape territorial governance throughout the Southwest. Beth, this evidence, it could bring down the territorial government and expose corruption that reaches all the way to Washington. Beth nodded grimly, understanding the terrible responsibility that Daniel's death had placed upon her shoulders. Rosa, my husband made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find a way to get this evidence to honest federal authorities who could act on it. But he also warned me that the people responsible for this corruption would kill anyone who threatened to expose them. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley morning air. But these riders moved with different purpose than Stone's mercenaries they approached openly. Without the stealth that characterized men planning violence, and their dust trail suggested they had come from the direction of town rather than the corporate operations center. "Beth," Miguel Morales called from his watch position near the front gate. "Riders coming from Tucson. Looks like territorial officials, but I count federal marshals with them." The arrival of lawmen sent both hope and terror through Beth's calculations. If honest federal authorities had come to investigate water rights disputes, Daniel's evidence could finally serve its intended purpose. But if the corruption reached into federal enforcement, the marshals might be here to eliminate the last witness to territorial crimes rather than to pursue justice. "Rosa," Beth said quickly, "help me secure these documents. If these are honest lawmen, they'll need to see the evidence. If they're not—" She left the sentence unfinished, but both women understood that some secrets were worth dying for. The delegation that approached the Harrison homestead was led by a man whose bearing and dress marked him as someone of considerable authority within territorial government. He rode a magnificent bay horse and wore the kind of expensive suit that spoke of political connections and substantial personal wealth. Behind him rode two men in federal marshal badges and a woman whose practical traveling clothes and independent bearing suggested she was something more unusual than a territorial official's wife. "Mrs. Harrison," the leader called out as they drew rein near the ranch house. "I'm Territorial Attorney General William Blackwood, here to investigate reports of water rights disputes in this district. These are Federal Marshals Crawford and Johnson, and Miss Catherine Wells from the Territorial Surveyor's Office." Beth studied the delegation with the careful assessment Daniel had taught her to use when evaluating potential allies or enemies. Blackwood carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding power, but his eyes held the calculating coldness that marked him as potentially dangerous. The federal marshals seemed professional, but watchful, as if they expected trouble. Most intriguing was Catherine Wells, whose presence suggested that this investigation might be more comprehensive than simple dispute resolution. "Attorney General Blackwood," Beth replied with careful courtesy, "I'm honored by your visit, though I'm not sure what assistance I can provide regarding water disputes. As you probably know, my late husband handled all our legal affairs." Blackwood's smile was professionally pleasant, but carried undertones that made Beth's skin crawl. "Mrs. Harrison, we're particularly interested in any records or documents that Commissioner Harrison might have left regarding water rights allocation in this district. There have been questions raised about the validity of certain corporate claims." The request sent alarm bells ringing through Beth's tactical instincts. If Blackwood was part of the corruption Daniel had documented, he was here to retrieve evidence that could expose the conspiracy. But if he was genuinely investigating corporate fraud, Daniel's records could provide exactly the proof that honest authorities needed. "Attorney General," Beth said carefully, "my husband's official records were transferred to the territorial capital after his death. I'm sure your office has access to anything that might be relevant to your investigation." Catherine Wells stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the only woman in male-dominated professional situations. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm specifically interested in any personal notes or observations that Commissioner Harrison might have made regarding geological surveys and water table measurements. The Territorial Surveyor's Office is trying to establish baseline data for future water allocation decisions." The technical nature of Wells's request suggested knowledge that went beyond simple administrative inquiry. Beth found herself studying the younger woman with growing interest, noting details that marked her as genuinely professional rather than merely decorative. "Miss Wells," Beth said slowly, "my husband did maintain personal journals regarding his water surveys. but I'm not sure they would be appropriate for official review without proper legal authorization." Marshal Crawford finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "Mrs. Harrison, we have warrants authorizing examination of any documents related to Territorial Water Rights Administration. We can conduct this investigation with your cooperation, or without it, but either way, we need to see those records." The moment of decision had arrived sooner than Beth had expected, forcing her to choose between revealing Daniel's evidence to officials who might be honest or might be part of the conspiracy he had died trying to expose. But as she studied the faces of her visitors, she noticed something that gave her hope. Catherine Wells was watching Blackwood with the same careful suspicion that Beth had learned to use when evaluating potentially dangerous authority figures. "Very well," Beth said finally. "Please come inside. But I should warn you that my husband's personal records contain information that some people might find disturbing." As the delegation prepared to enter the Harrison ranch house, Beth caught Catherine Wells's eye and saw understanding pass between them, the recognition that two women in a male-dominated world might share interests that transcended official procedures and territorial politics. The moment when Daniel's evidence would finally see the light of day had arrived, but Beth still didn't know whether she was about to witness the triumph of justice or sign her own death warrant by revealing secrets that powerful men had already killed to protect. The commissioner's legacy was about to be revealed, and with it, the truth about corruption that had poisoned territorial governance throughout the American Southwest. The question was whether that truth would bring justice or simply ensure that more graves would be needed to keep the conspiracy hidden. The interior of the Harrison ranch house felt charged with tension as thick as the Arizona air before a thunderstorm. As Attorney General Blackwood and his delegation examined Daniel Harrison's study with the intense scrutiny of people who understood that careers and possibly lives depended on what they might discover. Beth watched their reactions carefully, noting how Blackwood's eyes immediately went to the maps on the walls, while Catherine Wells focused on the technical surveys and geological documentation that revealed the true complexity of territorial water management. Commissioner Harrison was certainly thorough in his record-keeping, Blackwood observed, his tone carefully neutral as he studied maps that showed water rights allocations throughout the Gila Valley. "I had no idea that territorial water distribution was so complex." Beth opened Daniel's official filing cabinet, revealing documentation that would have impressed federal auditors with its meticulous attention to detail and comprehensive scope. But she was careful to direct their attention toward records that supported her husband's reputation for professional competence, while concealing the more explosive evidence that could expose territorial corruption. "My husband believed that water was the foundation of territorial development," Beth explained as she handed Marshal Crawford a bound volume of official surveys. "He spent 15 years documenting every stream, aquifer, and seasonal variation that affected settlement patterns throughout Arizona Territory." Catherine Wells moved to a detailed geological survey that showed underground water systems extending throughout the region, her professional training evident in the way she interpreted technical information that would have been meaningless to most territorial officials. "Mrs. Harrison," Wells said with growing excitement, "these surveys show underground water connections that our office has never properly mapped. Your husband identified aquifer systems that could support far more agricultural development than current territorial planning assumes." The revelation was both thrilling and dangerous, confirming that Daniel's work had implications that extended far beyond simple water rights disputes. If his geological surveys were accurate, They revealed that corporate claims about water scarcity were fraudulent justifications for stealing resources that could support substantial population growth and agricultural expansion. "Miss Wells," Beth said carefully, "my husband often mentioned that territorial water policy was based on incomplete information about actual water availability. He believed that proper scientific management could support much larger populations than current corporate development assumes." Blackwood's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as he grasped the implications of what Wells and Beth were discussing. If Daniel Harrison's surveys proved that water was more abundant than corporate interests claimed, the entire justification for concentrating water rights in corporate hands would collapse. "Mrs. Harrison," Blackwood said with forced casualness, "I'm particularly interested in any correspondence your husband might have maintained with federal authorities regarding territorial water policy. The Attorney General's office needs to ensure that territorial law is consistent with federal guidelines." The request was a fishing expedition designed to determine whether Daniel had shared his findings with federal authorities who might investigate territorial corruption. Beth recognized the trap, but also saw an opportunity to gauge whether Blackwood was part of the conspiracy or genuinely investigating it. "Attorney General," she replied carefully. "My husband's correspondence files are quite extensive. Perhaps you could be more specific about what type of federal communication you're seeking." Before Blackwood could respond, Marshal Johnson moved to the window with the alert posture of someone who had detected potential trouble. "Mrs. Harrison, are you expecting additional visitors today? I see riders approaching from the east." Beth's heart sank as she recognized the dust cloud that marked the return of Captain Stone and his mercenaries, their timing suggesting that they had been watching the ranch and waiting for the federal delegation to arrive. The convergence of territorial officials and corporate enforcers could hardly be coincidental. "Those are representatives of the Consolidated Water Company," Beth said with careful neutrality. "They visited yesterday to discuss water rights issues affecting my property." Catherine Wells moved to join Marshal Johnson at the window, her expression reflecting professional concern as she studied the approaching riders. "Mrs. Harrison, those men are armed like a military unit. Is it normal for water company representatives to travel with that level of security?" Beth's answer was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats as Stone's mercenaries arrived at the ranch house with the confident arrogance of men who believed they controlled the tactical situation. But their confidence faltered slightly when they recognized the federal badges and official territorial seals that marked their new opponents as more dangerous than an isolated widow. "Attorney General Blackwood," Stone called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying forced respect that didn't quite hide his displeasure at finding federal authorities on the property. "Captain Marcus Stone, security consultant for the Consolidated Water Company. I wasn't informed that territorial officials were conducting investigations in this district." Blackwood emerged from the ranch house with the measured dignity of someone who understood the political implications of being caught between federal oversight and corporate interests. "Captain Stone, the Territorial Attorney General's office is reviewing water rights allocations throughout Arizona Territory. I trust the Consolidated Water Company has no objection to ensuring that all territorial laws are properly observed. Cora." The exchange was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, with both men probing for information about the other's authority and intentions while maintaining facades of official courtesy. But Beth noticed that Catherine Wells and the federal marshals remained inside the ranch house, continuing their examination of Daniel's records while the political theater played out in the yard. "Not at all. Attorney General," Stone replied with practiced diplomacy. The Consolidated Water Company has always operated in full compliance with territorial law. We're simply here to finalize arrangements for water distribution that will benefit the entire valley. Beth stepped onto the porch with Daniel's official water rights documentation, a bound volume that contained enough legal technicalities to confuse any attempt at immediate resolution. Captain Stone, as I mentioned yesterday, all water rights affecting this property are properly documented and legally valid. If the Consolidated Water Company has questions about territorial law, I'm sure Attorney General Blackwood can provide appropriate guidance. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex as multiple parties with conflicting interests found themselves forced to maneuver within the constraints of territorial law and federal oversight. Stone's mercenaries clearly wanted to complete their intimidation mission, but the presence of federal marshals made violence politically dangerous. Blackwood needed to maintain his cover as an honest investigator while protecting whatever corporate interests he might represent. Most importantly, Beth needed to determine which of her official visitors might be trusted with Daniel's explosive evidence. "Mrs. Harrison," Catherine Wells called from inside the house, her voice carrying an urgency that suggested she had discovered something significant. "Could you help me interpret some of these geological notations? Your husband's survey methodology is more sophisticated than anything our office has seen." Beth excused herself from the political standoff in the yard and returned to the study, where Wells was examining Daniel's personal journals with the intensity of someone who understood their scientific significance. "Mrs. Harrison," Wells whispered, ensuring that her words wouldn't carry to the others. "Your husband's surveys show that territorial water allocation records are completely wrong. The corporate claims about water scarcity, they're fraudulent. There's enough water in this valley to support 10 times the current population." The confirmation of Daniel's findings sent excitement and terror through Beth's thoughts in equal measure. If Wells was genuinely honest, she could be the federal authority that Daniel had hoped would investigate territorial corruption. But if she was part of the conspiracy, Beth had just revealed that Daniel's work posed a mortal threat to corporate water monopolies. "Miss Wells," Beth said quietly, "my husband spent years documenting discrepancies between territorial water records and actual geological surveys. But he also discovered that powerful interests were falsifying data to justify corporate control of water resources." Wells's eyes widened as she grasped the implications of what Beth was revealing. "Mrs. Harrison, are you saying that territorial water policy is based on deliberately falsified information?" Before Beth could respond, the sound of raised voices from the yard indicated that the political maneuvering between Blackwood and Stone was escalating toward confrontation. Both women moved to the window and saw that additional riders were approaching from multiple directions: territorial deputies, more federal marshals, and what appeared to be newspaper correspondents whose presence suggested that word of the investigation was spreading beyond official channels. "Miss Wells," Beth said with sudden decision, "I'm going to show you something that my husband died trying to protect. But I need your word that you'll use this information to pursue justice, regardless of where the evidence leads." Wells met Beth's gaze with the steady resolve of someone who had chosen to work in territorial surveying because she believed in honest science and factual truth. "Mrs. Harrison, I swear by everything I hold sacred that I'll see justice done, no matter what powerful interests might be threatened." Beth moved to Daniel's concealed safe and withdrew the documents that contained the most explosive evidence of territorial corruption correspondence, proving that water rights had been fraudulently transferred. Financial records showing bribes to territorial officials, and most damaging of all, geological surveys proving that corporate claims about water scarcity were deliberate lies designed to justify theft. Dear God in heaven, Wells breathed as she examined documentation that could destroy careers and reshape territorial governance throughout the Southwest. Mrs. Harrison, this evidence, it proves that the entire territorial water policy is built on fraud and corruption. The moment of truth had arrived, but Beth still faced the crucial question of whether Catherine Wells could be trusted with secrets that had already cost Daniel his life. Outside, the confrontation between federal authorities and corporate interests was escalating toward violence, while inside the ranch house, two women examined evidence that could expose corruption reaching from local water companies to the territorial capital. The waters of truth were about to flow like Daniel had always promised they would, seeking their level regardless of the obstacles that powerful men might try to place in their path. The question was whether that truth would bring justice, or simply ensure that more blood would be spilled to protect the conspiracy that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Folks, this is getting absolutely intense. Catherine Wells seems like she might be the honest federal authority that Daniel was hoping to find. But with Captain Stone's mercenaries outside and Attorney General Blackwood's true loyalty still unclear, Beth is walking a tightrope over a canyon. That evidence she just showed. Wells could change everything if Wells can be trusted. What do you think is going to happen when this powder keg explodes? Let me know in the comments. And if you're on the edge of your seat like I am, smash that subscribe button. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the Harrison Ranch yard as the delicate political balance between federal authority, territorial power, and corporate muscle finally shattered like glass under pressure. Attorney General Blackwood stood between Captain Stone's mercenaries and the federal marshals, his carefully maintained facade of official neutrality cracking as he realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his ability to control through legal manipulation and political maneuvering. Inside the ranch house, Catherine Wells finished her examination of Daniel Harrison's explosive evidence with the growing excitement of someone who understood that she was witnessing history in the making. The documents spread across Daniel's desk represented more than just proof of territorial corruption. They were the foundation for a complete restructuring of water rights law throughout the American Southwest. Mrs. Harrison, Wells said with quiet intensity. This evidence is so comprehensive and damning that it could trigger congressional investigations into territorial governance across multiple Western territories. Your husband didn't just document local corruption. He exposed a systematic pattern of fraud that reaches from Arizona to Washington, D.C. Beth felt the weight of 15 years of careful preparation settling on her shoulders as she realized that the moment Daniel had been working toward was finally at hand. Miss Wells, my husband always said that truth finds its level like water seeking low ground. I think the time has come to let this particular truth flow where it needs to go. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunshots from the yard, not the sustained firefight of a serious battle, but the sharp crack of warning shots designed to establish dominance and prevent escalation. Both women moved to the window and saw that Stone's mercenaries had drawn their weapons in response to what appeared to be the arrival of additional federal marshals. "This is Federal Marshal Thomas Bradley," came a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding dangerous situations. By order of the United States Department of Justice, all parties will lower their weapons and submit to federal investigation of territorial water rights fraud. The declaration sent a visible shock through both Blackwood and Stone, who clearly had not expected their local political maneuvering to attract the attention of federal law enforcement. But Beth felt a surge of hope as she recognized that Daniel's careful preparation had included contingency plans for exactly this type of federal intervention. "Marshal Bradley," Blackwood called out with forced confidence. "I'm Territorial Attorney General William Blackwood. I'm conducting an official investigation into water rights disputes in this district. What authority does the federal government have to interfere with territorial law enforcement?" Bradley emerged from behind the cover of his mounted deputies, a man in his 50s, whose weathered face and confident bearing marked him as someone who had spent years dealing with the complex intersection of federal and territorial authority in the lawless regions of the American frontier. "Attorney General Blackwood," Bradley replied with professional courtesy that carried undertones of steel. "The Department of Justice has received evidence suggesting that Territorial Water Rights Administration involves violations of federal interstate commerce law and possibly treason against the United States government." The accusation hit both Blackwood and Stone like physical blows, confirming their worst fears about the scope of federal investigation and the potential consequences of their involvement in territorial corruption. Stone's hand moved toward his weapon, but the presence of a dozen,